Now, a charity set up to support the Jewish community says it's seen reports of anti-Semitic attacks in Scotland doubled last year to 68 incidents last year, up from 34 the previous year. The Community Security Trust says there were reports of more than 4,000 incidents across the UK. Well, earlier I spoke to Danielle, Bett, who describes herself as Scottish-Israeli, started by asking for her opinion on the rise of anti-Semitism.
Listen, I'll be honest and say it's sad and it's concerning, but I'm not surprised. Just not only from being online and seeing the rhetoric of the way that people are speaking to one another with regards to Israel-Palestine and the way that conversation is being dragged into communities, Jewish communities and Muslim communities in the country, and the way that minorities have been demonized. So I'm not surprised, but it's obviously going beyond online. We've seen a number of incidents on the streets of the UK. We know that there are things happening in schools. So it's really something that must be taken seriously, but it's to be expected, unfortunately.
And you touched on it just briefly, Danielle, but have you yourself experienced anti-Semitism?
Absolutely. I've been in Israel since the 7th of October, so I can only speak for online. Prior to that, being in Scotland, I have unfortunately experienced anti-Semitism. But online, there's so much anti-Jewish hatred. I'm a person who I'm in no way perfect, but I advocate for Palestinian human rights. I'm very critical of the Israeli government. I believe in the right of Palestinians to statehood, but that doesn't make me exempt from experiencing anti-Semitism. I've had death threats. I've had people celebrating the deaths of people around me in Israel on the 7th of October. Lots of dehumanization. So yes, definitely.
I mean, it's such an incredibly complex one when you talk about what is the kind of solution to this. But what would help? What needs to be done, Danielle?
So I think first and foremost, social media platforms have to be held to account, especially at the moment, even if you report threats of violence, really, really terrible incidents of anti-Semitism, very often nothing is done about them. And so social media platforms have to be held into account. We need stronger legislation because also these things are seeping into day-to-day life. They're increasing hatred. We know that algorithms are built so that people see content that makes them more likely to react, which is often angry reactions, but also a lot of fake news, which is leading to people to believe things that aren't true and to increase their hatred of one group or another. So I think that's really important. And I think we also have to help, in local communities and schools become better equipped to deal, because racism isn't just standard bullying. It's another level of hatred that has to be stopped and educated against from a very young age. So those are two serious things that can be done. Engaging and educating with minority communities, be they Jewish communities, Muslim communities, Hindu, any minority communities have to be better understood so that we can stop the hatred.
Do you get fearful at times?
It's a very complicated one because as someone who's lived in the midst of the Israel-Palestine conflict for different periods of my life, I suppose you could say that I've seen the worst case scenario of what happens when hatred erupts. So that scares me, because when two people have been completely dehumanized and turned to violence and a wall gets put between them and all they see is the perception of one another. I mean, look at where Israelis and Palestinians have landed. That's certainly not somewhere that anyone else would want to be. And having seen the way in which that's spilled onto the streets of the UK and other places, I don't think we're at a worst case scenario and that Jews aren't safe in London. But I think that something has to change so that we can continue to live safely, be it in London or France or the US or indeed in Israel.
The Jewish Leadership Council is saying there must now be an urgent conversation across all levels of government and civil society to establish how to break this link between foreign conflicts and hatred on the streets. Is that something that you would support?
Yes, absolutely. Listen, I don't think that advocating for Palestinian human rights is anti-Semitic. I don't think that calling or waving the Palestinian flag is anti-Semitic. I think people have the right to advocate for Palestine, to be concerned for what's happening in Gaza. However, when you assume that Jewish people are responsible for the actions of the Israeli government, or even when you assume that Jewish people, just because they have a connection to Israel, that makes them spokespeople for the Israeli army or the Israeli government, and therefore that they have a responsibility responsibility for their actions, that's really problematic and it's really dehumanizing. And again, I'll say that no minority community should be affiliated with the worst elements of its society, or indeed held accountable for the actions of political leaders.
And just very briefly, you describe yourself as Scottish Israeli. Is the experience in Scotland any different, do you think?
I think where it's different in Scotland is that Scotland's a smaller country, and indeed the Jewish community is smaller. And so even if there are a few incidents and not many, it's very much felt by such a tight-knit community because everyone knows one another. And so it feels very close to home. I think also when there are fewer minorities, you feel like you're more visible, perhaps as a target. When I lived in Scotland, I love Scotland, and my father is Scottish, but when you look different, I was often asked where I'm from originally, and therefore if you say Israel, then the follow-up question is very political, and so it's quite difficult sometimes to hide from your identity.
That's Danielle Bett there, Scottish Israeli, speaking to me just before we came on air.